Thank you for plugging into this Family Life News podcast, streaming issues-driven, family-focused news.
Welcome back to another edition of Hometown Heroes on Family Life. I'm Mark Webster. This week's guest, Jeff Seigworth of Pennsylvania, who recently completed a trip to war-torn Ukraine with A18 missions. In part one of our interview, he explains that A18 is a scripture reference for Acts 1:8.
Acts 1:8 is Todd Gallagher's mission organization in Ukraine. Todd has been in Ukraine for about the last 10 years. He's permanently resided in Ukraine for the last 5 to be the hands and feet of Jesus, meeting with the communities on the front lines and spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. I got involved with A18 missions back in May of this past year. With the war, a lot of the men that would have been helping support his mission had to go to the front lines. So I said, okay, never done a mission trip in the world. I've never traveled outside the United States, so let's go do this. And God called me to Ukraine to support Todd and his mission over there.
That's quite a first mission trip to take on.
Yeah, everybody asked me that. Even the Ukrainians were like, are you serious? You've never flown outside the United States? I was like, never flew. I've never actually flown in my life until last month. It's definitely a war zone. I can tell you that the mission over there, unless you were in the East, you really didn't see the strong impacts of the war. But even in the West, where we were at, Vinnytsia, really hasn't seen the impacts of the war because it's not an industry where there's a lot of military activity. So we really didn't see too much of what we call the face of war. In the early days of the war, there were a few missiles that flew into Vinnytsia, actually not too far from the church that we were at. You could see the wounds of war on the faces of some of the kids, on the limbs of some of the adults who had been injured by shrapnel or damage. But really the biggest impact we saw and what we were trying to work with using scripture and in our Bible and the games that we played was the mental health wounds of war, especially with the young kids. There were air raids that would go off to let us know that there were missiles incoming or aircraft. And when those air raids would go off, you could see the look of worry on these kids' face. And we worked with kids from as young as the age of like 5 to as old as the age of 18. To see these kids worry and yet still have joy. Like, I'm an American who's never been to a war zone. I've never been in combat, never served in the military. So I didn't know what to expect when I got there as far as like, what's it going to be like to be under air raid? And really the kids are what kept me at peace. I mean, they had a joy that surpassed all understanding. Yes, when the air raids would go off, they would look at their phones and find out what's going on. So the kids would just go back to having joy and playing and just being happy. It was like they had no fear because they knew where their peace came from. And I can tell you one thing that humbled me more than anything was the fact of how much they actually love Jesus. I cannot begin to explain in words. They did not have the fear of death like I did because not only have they been through this war, but they have this love for Christ that they know. And I had a child specifically tell me she knew that if she was killed today, she would go to heaven. And she would not have any fear because of that. And she's like, yes, the missiles scare us. But they're like, we don't worry about the missiles because if something happens to us, we know where we're going. And that was one thing that is very much alive in that country, in part because of the war, but because of the work that Todd's doing, especially with the churches that he's working with, is that the youth that are coming to these churches, they know Jesus far more, far better, far greater than a lot of people that I've met, even in my own church. It's amazing to see their love, not only for each other, but for a God that is all powerful and that they know will eventually aid them in winning this war or aid them in bringing peace to their country, whichever comes first. It's amazing to see that. And it was something that I absolutely fell in love with. And I had so much joy just enjoying and just absorbing because I couldn't absorb enough of it. It changed me. It moved me in such ways that I did not want to leave that country. The children of that country, we gave out shoe boxes, the Christmas shoe boxes that we do here in America, and we send overseas. I got to see and be part of the hands that handed those shoe boxes to kids. We gave them a Bible and a shoebox full of stuff, and it allowed them to take something home at the end of the day, because a lot of them kids don't have a whole lot to begin with. To just see and experience that absolutely moved me to my core.
That's part one of our interview with Jeff Seigworth of Pennsylvania, just back from the mission trip to war-torn Ukraine. Next week, a closer look at the lessons he says we can learn from the faith being shown by Ukrainians. Please join us again next week as we search for your home, your town, your hero. It's Hometown Heroes on Family Life.